prior to our last In the Zone conference in the second week of October last year. And I think when we started out, some of the things that surprised me about our program today, not just in terms of the speakers that we've had, but also that the audience that we've attracted, is the really strong community of engagement around this issue. Western Australia is to some extent a mining town, and there's something about mining technologies, mining investment, mining trade almost every week. Somewhat of a commodity, you might say. But what we've really seen in this group today is a real passion for this topic. For some companies that are just starting up, they might be very small, policy leaders. In the scheme of the Australian resources industry, some of the sectors that we're talking about, and this has been mentioned, are quite small when measured in dollar terms. But, as we've heard, these are really essential for the future of the global technology ecosystem, for climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts, and really to some extent for Australia's place in the Indo-Pacific region. And it's really my pleasure that we've been able to welcome over 250 guests here today to hear something that 12 months ago I might have thought might be a little bit of a niche topic. So thank you all for coming. But hopefully that's a transition into our final major panel of the afternoon, which was focused on policy innovations. And if I could summarise what I think we've heard in the program today so far, it really boils down to three things. The first is that there is a really major imperative to take these underdeveloped and to some extent underappreciated critical materials industries and build Australia's capacity in them. There are major sustainability challenges at stake. There are also major security challenges at stake. The status quo isn't working. We've also had an opportunity to hear international perspectives from many of our Indo-Pacific partners. And the interesting thing we hear there is that that imperative and that view of the sustainability and the security importance isn't just something that we here in Australia or even Western Australia talk about. This is a shared problem for the Indo-Pacific. So what we care about, our partners care about. And we've also been able to showcase a large number of new initiatives from industry, from academia, from civil society groups that are trying to do the groundwork to start building these industries up to where the world needs them to be. And one of the really excellent signs about this story is that government in Australia at multiple levels is really taking the lead in responding to that imperative and growing these new industries. And it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce three esteemed policy leaders who can help educate us regarding strategies and initiatives from Australian governments. Just to give a sense of who we have here, my first guest will be Dr. Heather Smith, PSM, who is the Secretary of the Commonwealth Department of Industry, Innovation and Science. Followed by Jenny West, who's the General Manager for Trade and Investment for the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, or as some of you may know it by its trade name, Austrade. And finally, Rebecca Brown, who is the Director General of the Western Australian Department of Jobs, Tourism, Science and Industry. I'm looking forward to hearing some discussion from you all and to educate our audience regarding how these are the agencies which are centrally responsible for delivering Australian policy and change in this space, how that's going to go. Heather, if I could start with you.
Thank you, Jeff. And can I congratulate you and Gordon for putting together a stellar conference. So I've certainly learnt a lot listening today, and my comments sort of reflect perspectives from a public policy platform, but also reacting and hearing what I've heard today. So it has been a great set of discussions. I thought I would focus on three key issues. Firstly, from, again, a public policy perspective, is this sector unique from anything we have seen before? Secondly, provide a policy advisor's perspective on the sector. How do we read it in terms of the advice we give to government? And thirdly, what is the role of government, which a number of you have raised today, recognising that I'm the advisor and the government is the decision maker. So I thought though first just to give you some context that, as Jeff said, I am the Secretary of the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science and Resources, which has two cabinet ministers attached to it, and we do have national responsibility for critical minerals. But this portfolio also includes key national science agencies, some of which you've heard from this morning, CSIRO, Geosciences, but also ANSTO, our nuclear technology organisation, which is also playing a role in this space. So I'm not an expert on critical materials, but I have been around public policy a long time and have and I think have hopefully some contributions to make in regard to how we think about this sector. There's no doubt that this sector is really underpinning a profound technological revolution, and that it is the building blocks of the fourth industrial revolution. So we are in a different space from where we have been before. I think primarily for two reasons. One, the speed of technology, and secondly, we now have China along with the US as the key global powers and drivers of technology along with other countries. That is a space that we have not been in before. But when we look at the market, it is a conundrum in how we characterise it, because at one level it appears underdeveloped and immature, despite the very ubiquitous use of which the products rise from this, and despite the economic and strategic importance of critical materials. So this, to us, raises a question that is the market truly immature and underdeveloped in a market sense, or has it developed this way because insufficient weight has been given to, firstly, competition and diversity of supply, and or B, the strategic importance of the end products for which critical materials are a non-replaceable input. So to us, this is an important question as policymakers, because it shapes the way on how we respond, of which there are many different ways we can respond, as we have heard from today. So we can speculate about how this market, or this parent market is immature and how that's arisen. It seems to be a combination of market forces, or the absence of market forces, the impact of fast first movers, the creation of monopolies, and in some cases it's been a clever long-term bet by a number of players. But we do know that history has consistently shown that anything that leads to monopolies or cartels as an input into production will not allow the creation of the greatest economic opportunities or the flow of wealth, and certainly will not give rise to the innovation that we need going forward. So I think historically we have tended to see resources broadly as a strategic or an economic issue, and that really depends on the perspective with which you come at it, and ultimately what the end use of that commodity is. But we do know that critical materials are both an economic and a strategic issue, as we've heard today. So what really makes critical materials, I think, different from other materials is that their end use in technologies is actually being applied almost universally to a spectrum of both strategic and economic issues. So, for example, as you know, automation, AI, robotics are being applied to solve next generation defence issues at the same time as they're being applied to raise economic productivity in mines and in factories. So again, their ubiquitous use is quite unique. So from a policymaker's perspective, we are faced with this challenge of we have to think holistically about it. Because if the issue was only economic, we would probably put more weight on market-driven solutions, perhaps assisted by competition policy, and perhaps through some minor government interventions that would facilitate the development of alternative extraction and processing operations, and we'd put emphasis, as we should, on greater market transparency. But if the issue is predominantly strategic, the case for government intervention within countries and across countries becomes stronger and does raise questions again around how government fosters particular sectors. So there's a spectrum of views on this depending on which aspect you come from that. So secondly, let me just come to a few points about a policy advisor's perspective. So this is how we read the market, again, or the non-market. We understand the sector is complex, that it's opaque, that it's fragile, with small traded volumes and narrow margins. We know that critical materials some are not necessarily rare, and there are sensible reasons that firms don't necessarily invest to extract them as a byproduct from another simpler mining operation. More broadly, when you look at it from the national interest perspective, not only in Australia do we want to be the source of raw materials, but as has been discussed today, we want to ensure we have a value-adding role. And we also want to ensure that we are fostering a multiplicity of producers across countries. So our objectives are threefold. We understand that project financing is a problem if we are to de-risk the existing pipeline of projects. And we can see a lack of diversity in the supply chain that is hampering market development and does expose all of us to supply chain risks. We recognise that. And also to the possibility of unexpected disruption at single points in a narrow chain. That is something we wonder about. So it's an issue for markets, it's an issue for businesses, and it's something we haven't discussed a lot today. It's an issue for consumers as the end point. We also understand the commercial reality that end users will always not look to make decisions that reflect value for money. So we have a mining sector in this country which is always operated in globally competitive markets, with most of that output being exported, which means competing on cost. So while actually reducing cost is an imperative and a primary driver, I think we also need to be aware that the short-term pursuit of lower cost solutions could also be creating supply chain vulnerabilities that we currently cannot foresee. So when we think about it, we think about what is the evolution of the business model of many of you of which are involved in here today. So thirdly, what is the role of public policy? I think the emergence of a more diverse, more secure market does require integrated action on both the supply and the demand side in order to help mitigate the risks that can help alter market dynamics. So this really requires focusing on how do we secure long-term offtake arrangements to underpin that bankability and to attract capital, both debt and equity, as was discussed today. How do we get greater market transparency to manage potential supply emergencies and again deliver greater stability to the markets? And thirdly, to ensure we have a more level playing field around environmentally friendly, sustainable and ethical production and safety standards, as has been discussed today. All of these are very good features of Australian mining industry as it currently stands. So the government can play a role in creating the conditions needed to grow this sector, and as you're aware, released a critical minerals strategy earlier this year, really focused on how do we support innovation, how do we attract investment, and how do we deliver the infrastructure that can bring critical material projects into production. But I really wanted to highlight technology. As you all know, technology is key. If it's the driver of global demand for critical minerals, then it's also the driver of innovation to unlock supply. And so clearly government has a role through our publicly funded research organisations. I would not underestimate the amount of money that governments do actually invest in publicly funded science agencies, much of what you are aware of, that do collaborate with the CRCs, and they're doing some tremendous work with partnering with many of your firms. We know we have to keep collaborating on R&D and including how we target new technologies. Amanda mentioned the importance of regulatory settings and having a stable operating environment, and I think the review into the EPBC Act is a very important opportunity for the sector to feed in concerns about regulatory barriers, as is the Productivity Commission's review that will take place over this year and into next. Good policy architecture is really important. Some of you have mentioned there is good working relationships at the federal level and with state governments, particularly through the COAG process, which is working through a work program on how do we get more systematic on thinking about our policy responses here. Something that hasn't come up today is the importance of a skilled workforce. The skills that are involved in this sector are in high demand across many other sectors. So that is a shared objective and a shared role, I think, between business and government. And also attracting investment, as Governor Beazley said this morning, that we have natural advantages by virtue of our geographic proximity and a sector that has strong ethical and safety standards that we should really use to attract investment. My final point is around coming to what role do we play as a country in the region and globally. I think fundamentally this is the ballast on which we approach our relationship, that as a country we will always support diverse, resilient and stable markets that meets the needs of all countries. And that means open markets, global norms and rules-based order. That has underpinned our prosperity. Some of that is under enormous stress, but we do need to work around diverse, resilient and stable markets. So we're building partnerships, as you're aware, at government level, academic level, and with industry. The Prime Minister's visit to the US, as you saw, has been very important. We will be holding discussions with our US counterparts in November. Minister Canavan, as the Minister for Resources, has recently visited India, where I was with him on that trip, and also Korea and Japan. We will work bilaterally, multilaterally, plurilaterally and trilaterally to ensure that markets do meet those objectives of how do we ensure a diverse and resilient outcome. We have in the Indo-Pacific, as Gordon mentioned and Aida-san this morning, is truly a positive narrative. And that is where we have a long history in this country of cooperating regionally in embryonic markets and also building the principles that should guide open markets. And I think that's a great representation here today. So final comment is that this is a collective endeavour. Very important that we do work together, both to ensure the opportunities but also to deal with unintended consequences.
Thanks very much, Heather. And your final point has enabled me to make a seamless transition to Jenny. So, Jenny, if I would start with an observation, as we've heard a number of stories about companies and research institutions, people who've beginning to be successful in this new developing market or have achieved some level of success and are looking for the next height. And a common theme that you kind of find around this, not just in the West Australian or Australian space, but around the world, is that those who are successful in this space take an international, are part of global value chains, they take an international partnership perspective. And often if you look at case studies of companies, they take it from day one in their development. So this is a nice point. Would you be able to educate us on Austrade's role in the policy space?
Thanks. So Austrade works across, thanks. We've got our 60 posts offshore, so we work very closely at a federal level across all government organisations and actually help in terms of attracting international investors into Australia, particularly around supply chains, critical minerals as well. We also, alongside this, very importantly, provide a strong thought leadership position. So the Critical Minerals 2019 strategy, looking at what we need to do around the 24 critical minerals that we've actually identified as being in high demand internationally, working with industry to actually provide their input in terms of pulling together a strategic vision for critical minerals in Australia. So we work both onshore with key businesses here. I just want to say a big thank you to you all for your openness, your involvement, your help in relation to formulating a lot of the thoughts and strategies around critical minerals. Your input is really valuable. And then we actually take international delegations and missions offshore to really meet with key international investors, see what other countries are doing in terms of supply chains, looking at that technology and innovation that's coming out from critical minerals as well, and assisting, of course, with some of those ministerial visits as well. It's a really important area. We see the whole ecosystem around this is really critical for Australia's future. So we're really keen to get investment in to help with supply chains and to actually build better capability and innovation in Australia as well.
Thanks so much, Annie. And to Rebecca, I would say our audience, and to some of the international audience that might not be here and might not be familiar with the Australian federal political system, a lot of our constitution vests significant responsibility regarding natural resources, industry regulation and infrastructure with provincial or state governments here. And Western Australia has played a really key role in Australia's role in the region as a resource supplier of reliability, technology, cost competitiveness and political trust for a very long time, going right back to probably the first major mineral resource export project that was developing a new market was Rio Tinto, or at that stage, Conzinc Rio Tinto Australia's Mount Tom Price project at Hamersley that was launched in 1962. For those who are in the mining industry, you might be surprised that Tom Price was a 484 million tonne iron ore deposit, which at the time was considered mind-bogglingly large, and by contemporary standards in Western Australia probably wouldn't even rate much of a business case built around it. But at the time, this was the largest bulk commodity export that anyone had done, and there was a significant role from the state government at that stage, the then Department of State Development, involved in doing that. And since that time, whether it's been more recent iron ore developments, other metals, agriculture in the north, or indeed gas, the Western Australian state government's played a really key role in complementing Commonwealth efforts at the domestic and international spheres. Would you be able to tell us about this?
So I might pick up on some of the previous comments, and yours, Jeffrey, thank you, and sort of continue the flow of certainly my agency's role in supporting the state government, both from a policy perspective, but then into how we actually actively promote and facilitate investment and trade down to the actual practical making it happen on the ground. But I might just start by putting some context, because Jeffrey, you did mention that we are a mining town, and we're very fond of that title. It's been a big part of our history, as you've just mentioned, but this state government has a very strong agenda around broadening the economy, broadening the industry base, recognising that gives greater prosperity to all West Australians, supports our economy more generally in riding out some of those highs and lows, and certainly diversification has been a key part. And by that, how we actually proactively promote and support not just trade and investment across a range of areas, but particularly in downstream processing and manufacturing, which I think is the area where the state seeks to lead in battery materials in particular, but also fostering innovation, science and technology across a range of areas. So I'll pick up on the point that we don't do that in isolation. I think we know, certainly through the Federation, there's a collective role between Commonwealth and state governments in providing that policy leadership, and as policy advisors we do that together, and certainly we work very closely with our Commonwealth agencies in facilitating trade and investment, whether it be through Austrade's international network or whether it be back into our local networks and actually facilitating those large projects into Western Australia. But the one thing I would say, and picking up on Heather's comments, when you talk about economic drivers, strategic drivers, the other element I would add is opportunity. And in 2017, the West Australian Government, and into 2018, saw a really important opportunity for Western Australia in what was happening globally, what was happening in industry, what was happening in research and academia, to take a really clear leadership role and commenced work on its own battery material strategy. It was very much aligned to that diversification agenda, so not just recognising that we had the resources and we had the long history of the capability to, for want of a better word, dig it up, but how do we take it the next stage and build that supply chain, that battery value chain. And I think underpinning that was also that very strong collaboration with industry, with research and academia, and obviously we've heard from the CRC today, of which that was a really a great recognition that Western Australia, in partnership and obviously with other universities, has got a really clear role in terms of that agenda going forward. In terms of the state's strategy around battery materials, very much focused on investment attraction. Again, we work closely with Austrade, but we play the next role, which is really actually proactively and practically supporting investment into the state, whether it be in assisting projects in terms of navigating our regulatory and approvals framework, in identifying industrial land. But we've been very fortunate as a state to see the benefits of working closely of some key projects that have taken off, and obviously Tianchi down in Kwinana is a big part of that, but also we've seen Albemarle in Kemerton. So we think that as a state government and as advisors in that role, we play the next practical step of actually making it happen. But we're also closely focused on how do we continue to build that research and collaborative approach to emerging technologies and how that translates into industry. so that we're not just facilitating projects, but we're seeing that transference of technology advancement directly into industry. And that gives us, we think, that real opportunity. It's not just that we have the largest lithium mine in the world, though we might like to mention it a few times, which is a great story of our state in terms of Greenbushes, which has been operating for 130 years, but has now become the largest lithium mine. But we're getting much more focused on how we diversify those industries, how we look at downstream processing, and how we see more of those benefits, whether it be about expanding our resources sector, but also into other industries to diversify the economy and generate benefits for all West Australians.
I might just add to that, thanks. In terms of how we work at a federal level down to a state level together, we're very interconnected, and with the likes of organisations like CSIRO, etc., to try to really ensure that we're getting very strong alignment. So where we will handhold investors from offshore all the way down into Western Australia, and they'll handhold them until the investment is happening. And an example of business feedback that's been fed into government policy that's made a difference with the states and territories is I did want to make sure that people were aware that there's a 5,000 talent visas for special new skills now for coming into Australia, and there's also some fast-track visa processing for investors as well. So that was a direct result of state and territory feedback as well as industry feedback around some of that, to actually say what are those skills and capabilities that we need for Australia in the science, the technology and those new innovative areas as well. And then importantly at Austrade, because we work across all sectors, we take a helicopter view, so we're working across all different sectors, whether it's defence, advanced manufacturing, space, science and technology, resources and energy. So what we try and do is to really ensure that we're taking that helicopter view and sharing best practice across those sectors, across different industries back into Australia as well.
Excellent. Just to finish our panel up, we have 250 people here who've come today for this, as I said at the start, possibly once upon a time would have been seen as niche topic. And the thing that unites everyone in the room, whether they're from academia, civil society, industry or government, is that they've identified the same imperatives that we all have here. Very quickly, just before we wrap up, I was going to give you one last shortcut for people in the room who really want to be part of an industry and a market that's developing, has its own trajectory, as you mentioned, Heather, but really is not at present stage fit for purpose for what we need in the 21st century, and want to be part of this, would you have one message?
My one message, because I sit across the broad innovation ecosystem, is that sometimes it's not necessarily about more money, it's about greater alignment. And that's what I hear today. There are many things going on in this room. Are they connected in a way that has the desired effect? So we actually have a third CRC on critical minerals, which was round 7, which was announced. And we have 2 other CRCs we've been talking about. We have growth centres that are working in this area. We have incentive structure, obviously, through the tax system, but through the supply chain and through the publicly funded science agencies, the more alignment we can get in addressing those aspects of the supply chain we were talking about today, I think there's a lot of gains that can be made. And I'm not just saying that because the finance minister has arrived. I never really think it's about funding a particular firm, because it's such a diverse set of issues. And as a policymaker, we do go through the motions of thinking, the role of government is very much set the policy environment, as Amanda said. Think about how you help facilitate through programs, how you help enable business. There is a discussion to be had about financing vehicles, and I think the time is right for that. But we are not necessarily in that world of being directive like some other states are. So we do have to work as an ecosystem, and as my colleagues were saying, work in a connected way to really focus on each aspect of that supply chain, and that includes onshore and offshore.
I'd just say it's really important to continue to provide us with feedback like you do from a business perspective. That input is absolutely critical. We need to build this together both across government and business. We want to really ensure, our goal is to support innovation, attract new investments, promoting opportunities while delivering that infrastructure and that end-to-end supply chain opportunities that's critical for Australia. So we're really keen to work collaboratively together to really ensure that we're creating that ecosystem for Australia.
Okay. Rebecca.
The last comment I'd probably make is we've talked about collaboration and those synergies are critical. What we do know is this is an emerging market, and we do know that it will reach a point at which competition is critical, and our competitors, whether they be other nations, will move rapidly, and it won't be enough for Western Australia or other states to have the resource. It will be a really fast-paced innovation agenda, and that point of translation from innovation academia into industry practice is the critical point, and that's the bit that will mean we will either keep pace with the world market or fall behind. I'm sure we're going to keep pace, but if that's the one place you want people to focus, it's that translation. And I think there's some really great examples, and I heard one last night from Tianchi in terms of the processing of tailings that'll keep their processing plant for going forward for another 20 years, and they need to develop that technology. That link between academia and industry and that pace of change is critical.
Thanks. This has been a real pleasure, and just as someone who's in the planning for this event spent a lot of time thinking about it and reading it, I think everyone who's here has probably read a lot of things about the imperative, about the technological uses, the strategic issues, the choke points, the ecological problems, all of these kind of things. But what this has been a real pleasure for me is that rather than going in a catastrophising sense as we have a problem here, there is some serious thinking at all levels of Australian government, both in a domestic and international outreach, about practical ways as what that means and practical ways we can be a part of that solution rather than simply we have a problem here. And so that makes me very confident, Rebecca, that you're right, we are going to be with it too. Anyway, as is customary, could you all join me in thanking our panel today? Thanks, Ed. Cheers.